Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know if he's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feeling pretty good about that?
In this episode, we hear from the team that traveled across the country reporting on one of its greatest threats, itself. They spent over a year covering the growing far-right extremist movement in the US that's spreading online and in neighborhoods, and why it presents such an immediate danger.
Go! Here's the thing, dude. Most white nationalists were in the military, dude. And they're coming out of the military today as white nationalists. I think it's just happening everywhere, man. And like, the military is honestly like a weird social experiment that reflects the civilian world anyway. You know what I mean? I think what you're saying is just consistent.
So you don't think it's a particularly radicalizing place? Because you said the white nationalists are coming out of it.
White nationalists come out of it, yeah, but they're coming out of everywhere, man. They're coming out of every community.
Thank you guys both for joining me today. Ben, this is obviously a very serious topic. We're talking about extremism, the US military. You are the reporter on this piece. You've worked on it for a long time. Tess, you are one of our senior extremism reporters here at Vice News, so you know the landscape, and I'm hoping to come to you for context often as we talk. To start, Ben, how did you get tipped off to this idea that it is a rising problem in the US military, that extremists are in it, or being trained in it? What did you learn? What was the process like?
Honestly, this is something that's been around since I've been reporting on extremism in these types of groups. I always spotted a veteran or even active duty serviceman. This goes back to groups like Atomwaffen Division, which is a designated terrorist group in multiple countries, and the base, that are both these sort of neo-Nazi paramilitary insurgent groups that kind of come up with ideas to take down the US government and arm themselves. But within these groups, often there are people who are veterans and also people who are active duty, people that are actually, they're in the military while they're in these groups, in these chats, discussing taking down the US government, and they've either worked for them or they're in it. So for me, it was something that I ran into a lot, and I felt like it deserved a complete deep dive. And of course, when January 6th happened, you have all of this reporting that came out that not only were there veterans there, but there were active duty people who walked down to Capitol Hill to try to overthrow it. And it definitely got me thinking about how America has reacted socially and culturally from the War on Terror years. And there's so many people who've participated. I think it's like upwards of 2 million veterans who've come from these series of wars. And what do they do with their skills and their brotherhood, so to speak, after? And it is to say that this is a major problem in the US military, both with veterans and people who are still in it, but it's not a widespread problem in that, you have a small percentage of these guys who are extremists, but when they are, we found, and experts will tell you this, they play a very outsized role where they make these groups more dangerous, they make them more organized. So to me, it was a major feature that I think just kept popping up, and we had to take a look.
Whether it's Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, or 3%ers, the presence of people with U.S. military backgrounds in right-wing extremist groups has been growing way before Jan 6th, and we want to understand why.
To take the oath doesn't have an expiration date. Just because I no longer serve in the Coast Guard, I will honor my oath with my dying breath. I will not comply.
USA! 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 USA!
And Tess, as you sort of take the temperature of the extremism space, is this something you've also found?
In terms of the crossover between the military and for sure. For example, I covered the Boogaloo movement, the anti-government movement with guys showing up in Hawaiian shirts to anti-vax protests, COVID lockdown protests or George Floyd protests with guns. And a lot of those guys who were in this very anti-government movement, talking about overthrowing the government and sort of talking about violence against federal officers, were also either veterans or had ties to the military, which is sort of a bit of a cognitive dissonance if you think about it, serving our country on one hand, and then also about talking about overthrowing the government on the other.
On one hand, it almost makes sense to some degree, which is to say, if you're a young person who is interested in weaponry and military operations, the military is a great place to go. But on the other hand, the very training that the United States is pouring billions of dollars into giving its citizenry to protect itself could be that which is used to try to bring the government down from the inside. It's super messed up, but it's also like, yeah, of course.
I mean, there's historical precedence for it. We've seen it. You see something like, for example, the Ku Klux Klan, when it was first created and founded, it's mostly Confederate soldiers. A Confederate war hero, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was its first Grand Wizard. And they call it a Grand Wizard because he was, quote, the wizard of the saddle during the Civil War. And this is a very paramilitary organization. If you see every single American war since, you see a rise of the Ku Klux Klan or you see a rise of the far right. I mean, someone like Timothy McVeigh, this was a Gulf War veteran. He was decorated. And when he got out, he got involved with the far right and the anti-government movement. And of course, he ended up being the mastermind behind the Oklahoma City bombing. So it's something that has been consistently happening for the last, since the Civil War. And it's not new. And when you look at like I said, the amount of veterans that have come out of these most recent wars, it was bound to happen. And interestingly, this is something that a lot of experts told us, is that it's not surprising that we're seeing a rise of this in this exact moment because we've been at war for 20 plus years.
And so in a sense, it is an escalation because we've been at war for 20 years. It's also been wars that haven't been particularly popular on a broad sense in the American populace, at least in the last 10 years or so. So these are people who have been highly trained, effectively said what you did in the theater of war is something we don't like by many of the people in the United States, and have a grudge. Like, tell me about the architecture of it. Like, how do people go from like, man, I'm in the military to man, I'm in the military and I'm like an extremist?
I think also there's something about the military at times where it regiments you and it gives you such group cohesion, it gives you a purpose, and when you get out of that and you have no support structure, you kind of want to find that again. And I think you look at something like an extremist group, they really are, people, I'm sure you've come across this, they describe them almost like gangs, but also it's kind of like a family. So I think some people, when they're lost, they get involved with these groups and suddenly they have, Tuesday nights, they go to rallies together. There's, they show up to school board meetings together, or they march on Capitol Hill. So I think part of it as well is sort of when you get out, what do you do? How do you keep having, the same camaraderie? And for some people that means joining a group like the Oath Keepers and doing paramilitary exercises on the weekends and then showing up to a BLM protest on a Wednesday.
Tess, have you found that sort of cultural overlap?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, for example, one of the lead organizers of the Proud Boys, Joe Biggs, former military, talks very open about the fact he has PTSD. I think there's also something about wanting that camaraderie that you get from the military, but also people who are vulnerable in terms of their mental health, and how these groups sort of prey on those individuals who want a sense of belonging or are lost in their lives.
Ben, you're saying it's not a big group of people necessarily in the military, but it is a group that is very powerful in the sense that they can take these skills outside of the military, form effectively domestic insurgencies against the United States government. So if I'm in the military and I'm like top brass, I might say to myself, this is a big problem. What are we doing about it?
Well, that's the thing. There was a lot of political will, I think, right when the Biden administration first came into power, because you just had January 6th. There had clearly been reporting showing tons of people connected to the Pentagon who'd been involved or connected to the broader US military. And they issued something called a stand-down order, which was essentially a 60-day thing where units were supposed to literally pause and reflect on the problem with extremism. I think the problem is truly it's a political will thing. And the minute the midterms came up, you saw the Democrats backing off this type of extremist chatter because they didn't want to be seen as going after, the brave men and women who fight in uniform for the US government, even though we know this is very much a problem. We spoke to Senator Warren, who she said, if there's a problem, we need to investigate it. But the Senate Armed Services Committee literally put a stop to it they put a line in a budget this year to direct the Pentagon to stop looking into this and stop putting funds into this. Yeah.
And this is even, and you mentioned Timothy McVeigh, this is not a new problem. This is a problem that has killed Americans, right? Killed civilians here in the United States.
And we had a historian expert, Kathleen Ballou, at Northwestern University tell us, she said, we don't really know how extensive this problem is because the Pentagon hasn't effectively fully researched it. So while I say there's a small percentage, that percentage could be a lot higher.
What we're seeing is only a small slice of what we should think is happening. There's never been a momentum stop. There's never been a decisive trial. We're decades, if not generations, into this problem. We have an archive of how it works. We just don't have the real-time information yet to know exactly where we are.
Also, sort of asking people to self-identify whether they are in an extremist group also does not adequately reflect the landscape of modern-day extremism. I think it's much more sort of diffuse now. You know, if you go on Truth Social, for example, Trump's platform, the kind of rhetoric you see there from just like everyday people or like Trump supporters is so, it's very, very close to what you see coming out of militias. You know, people sort of talking about 1776 and talking about like get the rope, talking about like, you know, about sort of violence against members of Congress. And so it's just hard to sort of draw the line between like membership in a group and then just one of the even radicalized people who stormed the Capitol who were not part of the Oath Keepers of the Proud Boys, were just sort of radicalized Trump supporters.
That actually brings me to a question about sort of defining extremism in this regard, because how do we define extremism as the people you're identifying that are increasingly part of the US military, or the US military is a breeding ground for that kind of extremism? I imagine far right would be an easy word to use, but can you put more detail to that?
I mean, it's absolutely far right. These are people who view the government with so much animosity, they want to take it down. And I think that is kind of the broad umbrella in which you can place all these groups. Within that, you've got, you know, neo-Nazis, you've got white supremacists, which is a different concept. But when you look at these groups, you have, you know, let's say the Oath Keepers. They're supporting police, they're supporting structures in which, you know, that go after people of color. That is white supremacist. Now, then you look at something like white power or white nationalist. There are distinctions, but they're all anti-government because they all believe that the government that's currently in place in the US government is not effectively administering their point of view, which is to say a far-right white supremacist point of view.
People who join the military tend to be young men, right? So like if you're exposed to that prior to joining the military through social media, through your social groups and, you know, whatever you do, and then all of a sudden you're in the military. What is it particularly about the military that makes it such an effective breeding ground for those who have anti-government extremist views?
I think that the military offers people opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise get. So especially for sort of, for like poor people who aren't going to be able to go to college or something, like the military offers them structure and opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. So if you're coming in already slightly jaded about what the country has failed to give you, and then you're sort of in this breeding ground with other people who have those experiences.
It is an issue that builds on itself. You know, there's not one, you know, silver bullet as to what makes an extremist in the military. I think I always say the one overarching similarity between all of these groups and all these people is that mostly are young, angry men. Mm-hmm. You know, that's something that I think, you know, ISIS pulled on that. It's not a new phenomenon, but young, angry men go in and often they can leave young, angry men.
What has our blood bought us? Where does the Aryan get to cash out? We spilled a lot of it, dude. For 100 years, man, a whole lot, dude. Since the Civil War, dude.
And do you think that that's something that, you know, some veterans come out thinking?
I think everyone thinks it, man. Everyone from a military family, dude. Why bleed for this?
What's the danger, I guess, overall of having the military be a breeding ground for extremism?
So it still is, and it continues to be. However, I think when you have these types of individuals and you're empowering them, you know, in murderous situations, quite literally. If you look at something like the Marines you have Marine Raiders. For a long time, these are highly trained people who do hyper advanced missions, and one of their symbols was the Nazi SS, and they had tattoos of it. They were caught doing it. I've heard from sources that there's so many times in which you look at the war in Afghanistan or Iraq where some of these guys were killing pretty indiscriminately. So that's one danger. The longer these types of hyper extreme people are in the military, the more training they get, the more advanced it could be. So when they get out, if they still have these skills, they can then train other people on them. So one of the dangers is that you have these military guys, and let's say you join the Oath Keepers and you have no military experience. Let's say you're going to train once a week. You can start getting some of these skills.
Have you found benefit to those who were in the military within these extremist groups? Does it give you cred?
Of course. I mean, there's a reason that they are sought out by extremist groups, that they specifically try to recruit people with military experience because they know that they're going to be useful for them. And then once they're, and there's a draw for the person who has military experience because they know that they're going to be, when they're in there, they're going to have a special sort of treatment. They're going to be treated, street cred within their groups.
Now, this is a problem, and it's a problem that's in the military. And my mind goes back to other systemic problems that happen in the military, and a culture of silence that is oftentimes overlaid on top of it, and a chain of command that doesn't necessarily mean accountability and daylight can really come out. Did you find that in this reporting as well?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think, especially I've received death threats over reporting on some of this kind of stuff, just because there really is a cone of silence, not just a cone of silence, but a cone of respect, where criticism equals, damnation. And I think that's kind of the issue with this, is that it's not that the military is wrong, it's that this is a problem in the military, let's make it better. But it becomes so toxic that people say that you're, going after men and women in uniform who protect this country. And, it's like, no, we're trying to sort out an issue. And that extends to people in the military. Some people don't want to talk. I've gotten people to, but certainly it's a blockade.
There was also some numbers that came out that showed sort of declining enrollments, people signing up for the military. And I remember seeing sort of Marjorie Taylor Greene, right-wing politicians pouncing on that and saying, look what you've done, look at what you've done, Democrats. You are scaring people away from joining because, you've called them extremists, you've called them white nationalists, and now they don't want to join. So look what you've done.
How did you get access to people who would talk openly about this?
With some of them, we had internal sources and groups that fed us information, so we were able to look at records of what people were saying. Others, I found their contacts online through sources, and I messaged them and said, can we talk about this? One individual, an ex-Marine named Christopher Polhouse, who's become sort of this semi-neo-Nazi Telegram celebrity, and he's in Maine, and he's trying to create an all-white compound up there, like a community. And he was quite open to talk. I mean, I'm sure Tess is kind of like any group, right? It's like you kind of shoot your shot, see if they'll talk to you.
Right, and some of them really want that exposure, some of them don't. A lot of them are just egomaniacs and desperate to get themselves on TV, and they also hope that they can use the reporter to get their ideas out there. I mean, you're smart enough to and also know that there are tricks to know how to ask the questions and also which material to actually use. But we've seen plenty of examples where that's not been the case, and they end up getting sort of a mini manifesto out there to help them recruit more people.
Maybe one of the ways that we can think about that is, could you just articulate some of the views that these people have that we call extremists that are in the military?
Well, they believe some of them believe in the 14 words, which is a neo-Nazi concept, securing a future for white children, which excludes everyone else. There were active duty servicemen who were part of a group called Atomwaffen Division, whose entire goal is to eradicate the world of people of color and Jewish folks. So these are kind of the extreme opinions that not only is it, I believe white people are better than, everyone else, which is, I would say, the sort of passive white supremacy that we see all around us, versus I want a completely white state. I want nobody else there, and I will apply violence in order to get this goal.
I'm also curious, You do a lot of reporting on like the most hardcore neo-Nazi white supremacist types, and I guess I focused more in the last year on that sort of more of the gray area, or extremists who kind of co-opt the language of mainstream politics to gain a foothold in the mainstream. And like the Proud Boys, for example, we've seen after January 6th, really tried to build alliances in their local communities by like showing up school board meetings because they were really cared about critical race theory or drag queen story hours, all these things that the GOP are also talking about. But you have extremist groups who are like sort of mobilizing around these issues. And so I'm wondering, like with the military, like that's, I can imagine it's a difficult kind of gray area for them as well, policy-wise, or if they're monitoring their social media, because if you've got someone who maybe is an extremist, but is also using the same language of the GOP, like what do you do with that person?
Well, that's one of the things that they found in some of the new directives, that your social media can be grounds for you to be in trouble with whatever unit you're in if you say support the Oath Keepers or the 3%ers. But we also found that if you do that, that could be as simple as a talking to, and it's over. But the problem is, a lot of these guys have in the past really crossed the line and didn't really face any punishment for it.
Well, thank you, Ben, for this report, and Tess for all of your reporting, and for both of you for joining me today.
Thanks.
You.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.